November 25th, 1863, Chattanooga, Tennessee. The air above Missionary Ridge tastes like gunpowder and wet granite. It is cold, the kind of cold that has no mercy, that drives its fingers through wool coats and presses its palms flat against your ribs until your lungs ache. Below the ridge, 23,000 Union soldiers are standing in a muddy valley, looking up at something that resembles a wall more than a hillside. Missionary Ridge rises 500 feet out of the Tennessee earth. It is steep, rocky, laced with Confederate rifle pits at the bottom, fortified trenches at the crest, and 40 pieces of artillery pointing straight down into the valley like loaded pistols aimed at a man's face. On the opposite end of the valley, standing at a signal post on Orchard Knob, is Ulysses S. Grant. He has a cigar between his teeth. He has his field glasses raised. He is watching the most disciplined army in the West prepare to execute his plan with surgical precision. The plan is not complicated. It is, in fact, deliberately limited. Grant doesn't want Thomas's men to storm Missionary Ridge. That is not the assignment. That is not even close to the assignment. The assignment is a diversion, a feint, a military sleight of hand. Grant's real play is happening on the flanks. Sherman is hammering the Confederate right. Hooker is rolling up the Confederate left. Thomas's job is simple. March to the base of the ridge. Take the first line of Confederate rifle pits. Stop. Hold the position. Make noise. Make Bragg think the center is under assault, so he pulls his reserves away from the flanks where the real damage is being done. That's it. That is the entire order. Take the rifle pits. Stop. 2 words, 2 syllables. Stop. In approximately 90 minutes, those 2 words are going to be the most comprehensively disobeyed order in the entire history of the American Civil War. And the man who refused to stop them, the quiet, immovable general from Virginia who Grant never fully trusted, is about to pull off the most improbable military victory of the conflict. To understand why George Henry Thomas did what he did, you first have to understand why Grant gave the order he gave. And to understand that, you have to understand the nightmare of Chattanooga before the battle. Because the city itself was not a battlefield first. It was a trap. A slow, suffocating trap, and the Union Army was already inside it. Go back 2 months. September 20th, 1863. A creek in northwest Georgia called Chickamauga. In the Cherokee language, Chickamauga means river of blood. The Cherokees named it before the Europeans arrived. They named it prophetically. On that day, the Army of the Cumberland, under General William Rosecrans, was getting annihilated. The Confederates under Bragg and James Longstreet had found a gap in the Union line, a mistake born of miscommunication and a misread order. They poured through it like water through a broken dam. The Union right collapsed. Rosecrans himself fled the field. He rode back to Chattanooga in a panic, leaving his army to die, except it didn't die, because of one man. George Thomas took command of the disintegrating Union left flank. He found a shallow, round hill called Snodgrass Hill. He put his men on it. He told them they were not moving. That was it. That was the entire speech. The Confederates came in waves. They came from the front and the flanks. They came screaming the rebel yell, crashing through the scrub brush with bayonets leveled. Thomas's men loaded, fired, reloaded, and fired again. They fought until the barrels of their rifles blistered their hands. They fought until the ammunition ran out, and then they fixed bayonets. They held that hill for 6 hours. 6 hours of pure, unbreakable resistance that allowed what remained of the Union Army to escape into Chattanooga. The Army gave him a name that afternoon. They called him the Rock of Chickamauga. It wasn't a metaphor, it was a physical description. The man simply could not be moved. But now, sitting in Chattanooga after the disaster, Thomas and his army were starving. The Confederates under Braxton Bragg had seized the high ground surrounding the city on 3 sides. Lookout Mountain to the southwest, Missionary Ridge to the east, the Tennessee River behind them. They controlled the roads, they controlled the railroad. They were squeezing Chattanooga like a fist around a man's throat. The Union soldiers inside the city were eating parched corn and raw onions. The horses were dropping dead in the streets from starvation. Men were cutting the leather from their harnesses and boiling it for soup. 14,000 horses and mules died during the siege. The The smell of rotting animal flesh hung over the city like a permanent fog. Rosecrans, broken in spirit and scrambling in his thinking, was sending panicked telegrams to Washington that grew less coherent by the day. Lincoln read them and knew the disease. It was the same disease that had infected Pope, Burnside, and Hooker. It was the paralysis that came from staring at the enemy too long. It was fear dressed up as caution. Lincoln relieved Rosecrans. He gave command of the entire Western theater to Grant. And Grant, who had turned the Mississippi River into a Union highway and taken Vicksburg without flinching, rode into Chattanooga on October 23rd. He arrived on a limping horse, soaked to the bone, still nursing an injury from a fall. He looked bad. He looked like a man who had no business being in command of anything larger than a card game. But Grant had one quality that overrode his appearance every single time. He solved problems. He didn't debate them. He didn't schedule them for a future meeting. He didn't ask Washington for permission. He solved them. Within 48 hours, Grant had reopened the supply line. He opened what the soldiers called the Cracker Line, a logistical route through the mountains that brought food, ammunition, and new horses into the city by steamboat and wagon road. It was a masterpiece of engineering and improvisation. By November, the Union Army was eating again. It was rebuilding. It was getting ready to fight. And this is where the tension began. Because the moment Grant arrived, he and Thomas started circling each other like two men who both believed they were the smartest person in the room. They were nothing alike. Grant was impatient, aggressive, and instinctive. He operated on feel, on the gut certainty that the best way to find out what the enemy would do was to hit him in the face and watch his reaction. He trusted momentum. He trusted the attack. He believed that an army moving forward was always more dangerous than an army standing still. Grant also had a reputation that preceded him. He moved fast. He decided fast. He expected his subordinates to move and decide fast. Any hesitation was weakness. Any request for more time was a symptom of the slows, the disease that had cost Lincoln so many generals. Thomas was something else entirely. George Thomas moved like a glacier. He was deliberate, methodical, and thorough in a way that bordered on maddening to men like Grant and Sherman. He did not rush. He did not improvise. He gathered his intelligence. He studied his ground. He checked his supply lines twice and then checked them a third time. When he was satisfied, and only when he was satisfied, he committed. His men loved him for it. They knew that when Thomas ordered an attack, it had been planned, resourced, and prepared to the point where victory was as close to a mathematical certainty as war allowed. The men of the Army of the Cumberland did not follow Thomas because he was inspiring. They followed him because he didn't get them killed for nothing. But Grant looked at Thomas and saw a man who needed to be nudged, pushed, told to move. In the weeks leading up to the battle at Chattanooga, Grant had already tried to replace Thomas. He had issued an order before he even arrived in the city, telling General Gordon Granger to relieve Thomas from command. The message arrived before Grant did. Thomas read it. He is reported to have said simply that he would hold Chattanooga until he starved. Grant received this message and changed his mind. You cannot relieve a man who answers an order to retreat with a promise to hold until he starves. There is no comeback to that. Grant let Thomas stay, but the friction was real. Grant thought Thomas was too slow. Thomas thought Grant was too reckless. And now, on November 25th, Grant needed Thomas to do something very specific. He needed him to be a decoy. The plan was Sherman's show. Grant believed in Sherman the way you believe in a weapon you've used before, and trust. Sherman had 4 divisions. He had crossed the Tennessee River the night before in a brilliantly executed night crossing. He was going to smash into the Confederate right flank on the north end of Missionary Ridge, roll it up, and drive down the ridge like a man sweeping debris off a table. That was the killing blow. Thomas's charge at the center was window dressing. It was designed to keep Bragg from pulling troops to reinforce Sherman. It was a distraction. Thomas received the order. He read it the way Thomas read everything. Quietly, carefully, with a face that gave nothing away. He formed his 23,000 men in the valley below Missionary Ridge. They were not going to take the ridge. They were going to take the first line of rifle pits at the base of the ridge. Then they were going to hold and wait while Sherman did the real work on the flanks. That was the plan. At 3:30 in the afternoon, 6 cannon shots ring out from Orchard Knob. This is Grant's signal. The advance begins. What happens next is something that military historians still struggle to fully explain. 23,000 men step off the line. They move across the open valley in a parade ground formation, flags forward, officers on horseback. The Confederate artillery on top of the ridge opens up immediately. The shells come screaming down. They tear craters in the ground. They cut holes in the formations. The men close the gaps. They keep walking. The rifle pits at the base of the ridge, manned by Confederate soldiers from Alabama and Tennessee, begin firing. The range closes. The Union soldiers start running. They hit the rifle pits in a wave. There is a moment of brutal hand-to-hand violence. Rifle butts swing. Men go down. And then the Confederate first line breaks. The rebels scramble backward up the slope, abandoning the pits. The Union soldiers pour into the trenches and throw themselves down, breathless, shaking, bleeding, and alive. This is the moment they were supposed to stop. Grant's order was explicit. Take the rifle pits. Hold. Wait. They are in the rifle pits. The order is fulfilled. Grant is watching from Orchard Knob, 600 yards away. He can see through his field glasses that the rifle pits are taken. The plan is working. Sherman just needs time. He lowers his glasses. He begins drafting the next phase, and then something impossible happens. The men do not stop. A regiment from Ohio looks at the soldiers who fled the rifle pits running up the slope. They look at the Confederate artillery still pounding them from the crest above. They realize something that no general's order fully anticipated. The rifle pits at the base of the ridge are a death trap. The Confederates at the top of the ridge are firing their cannon and their rifles straight down. The angle is too steep to effectively hit the soldiers pressed against the base of the hill, but the moment the soldiers stop and expose themselves in those open rifle pits, the men from above can aim and cut them apart at leisure. Stopping in the rifle pits isn't safe. Stopping in the rifle pits is surrender. The only direction that makes physical sense, the only direction where the rock and the slope itself provides cover from the guns above, is up. It starts with a handful of men, then a company, then a regiment. Then the entire Army of the Cumberland rises up out of the rifle pits as if lifted by a single enormous fist and begins climbing Missionary Ridge. Not because anyone ordered them to, not because any general waved a sword and pointed upward. They climb because they were the army that had been humiliated at Chickamauga. They were the men who had watched Rosecrans ride off the field like a coward while they bled and held the line. They were the men who had spent 2 months starving inside Chattanooga, eating leather and watching their horses die. They were the men nobody believed in. Not Grant, not Sherman, not Washington. They were the diversion, the decoy, the distraction. Not anymore. Grant watches through his field glasses. His jaw tightens. His cigar stops moving. He lowers the glasses. He turns to the officer next to him, General Gordon Granger. The words come out quiet, but the tone underneath them is the sound of a man watching his carefully constructed plan spontaneously combust. "Who ordered those men up that ridge?" Granger stares at the hillside. He has no answer. Nobody has an answer because nobody ordered it. Grant turns to Thomas. Thomas is standing nearby. He is watching the hill with the same unreadable expression he always wears. He might be watching a sunrise or a flood. His face does not change. "Thomas," Grant says, "who ordered those men up the ridge?" Thomas looks at Grant. The accounts of what was said next vary slightly depending on whose memoir you believe, but the substance is consistent. Thomas answers calmly and without apology. "I don't know," he says. "I did not." There is a silence. Then Thomas adds something that some accounts record as a quiet, almost cold observation. He says in effect that when it works, it won't matter who ordered it. Grant says nothing more, because Grant is a professional. He understands that this is now a fluid situation. He understands that what he does in the next 30 seconds will determine whether 23,000 men die on a Tennessee hillside or accomplish the impossible. He watches. He waits. He keeps his hands off the wheel. What happens on Missionary Ridge over the next 40 minutes is one of the most extraordinary feats of raw human determination in American military history. The slope is brutal. It averages a 45-degree grade in places. The men are climbing with their rifles in their hands, using the rocks and scrub brush as handholds, pulling themselves upward. The Confederate soldiers at the top are looking down at them with a mix of horror and disbelief. This is not supposed to be possible. Every military manual ever written says you cannot assault a heavily fortified ridge with an uphill frontal charge. You will be annihilated by the defenders firing from above. The geometry of it is murderous, except the Confederates made a fatal mistake in their fortifications. General Bragg's engineers had placed the main defensive works at the geographic crest of the ridge, the highest visible point. What they failed to account for was that the geographic crest is not the same as the military crest, the point from which defenders can actually see and fire down upon attackers. The defenders can see the men at the bottom of the slope clearly, but as the Union soldiers climb, they enter a blind zone. The Confederate guns, aimed downward at the angle calculated to hit men in the valley, overshoot. The shells pass over the climbing men and explode in the air or in the valley below. The rifles pointed over the parapet cannot depress enough to hit men pressing against the face of the slope. The Confederates realize the problem too late. They try to roll artillery shells down the slope like bowling balls. Some of them fire pistols, some throw rocks. The Union soldiers keep climbing. Individual companies reach the crest at scattered points along the ridge. They jam their flags into the Confederate earthworks. They engage the defenders in point-blank rifle fire and then hand-to-hand fighting. The rebel yell is answered by the wordless roar of men who have been hungry and humiliated for 2 months and are done with both. The Confederate line doesn't bend, it shatters. It breaks in multiple places simultaneously, and the break is total. Bragg's men don't fall back in good order. They run. They abandon their artillery pieces with the primers still in place. They drop their rifles. They stream off the backside of Missionary Ridge and don't stop until they have put miles between themselves and the Union soldiers who just climbed a mountain without being asked to. Back on Orchard Knob, Grant watches the Confederate flags on the crest of Missionary Ridge disappear and Union flags replace them one after another. He watches the rebel army dissolving off the back of the ridge like smoke in a wind. He has won a complete, stunning, unexpected victory. The Union Army did not take the first line of rifle pits as a demonstration. They took the ridge, the whole ridge, in one charge. An unauthorized, unsanctioned, spontaneous charge that military logic said was suicidal and history says was magnificent. Grant's fury is real. He later writes about it with the particular restraint of a man who is still angry but knows he cannot say so loudly because the anger would sound ridiculous next to the result. He had a plan. The plan was overridden by the initiative of the men. The plan worked better without his plan than it did with it. That is not a comfortable thing for a commander to admit. It is perhaps the one moment in the entire war where Grant's authority was challenged not by a subordinate's insubordination, but by the sheer unstoppable will of 23,000 men who had made up their collective mind. But here is what the history books miss. Here is the part that gets glossed over in favor of the cinematic spectacle of men climbing a ridge. Thomas knew not the specifics, not the exact moment, but Thomas understood something about the psychology of his army that Grant had not yet learned. He understood what those men needed. He understood that the Army of the Cumberland was not a broken instrument. It had been treated like one. Rosecrans had shattered its confidence at Chickamauga. Grant had arrived and treated it as the second-string team, the warm-up act for Sherman's headline performance. Thomas had watched his men for 2 months in that starving, miserable, besieged city, and he had seen what was building inside them. It was not despair, it was pressure. The kind of pressure that had nowhere to go. And Thomas, who never wasted a word or a gesture, who never performed courage and never faked confidence, understood that the men would not stop at the rifle pits. He had not ordered them to charge the ridge, but he had also not done anything to prevent the conditions that made the charge inevitable. When Grant asked him who gave the order, Thomas told the truth. He did not. But his silence in the answer carried the weight of a man who understood exactly what had happened and was comfortable with it in a way that Grant found profoundly unsettling. The relationship between these two men is one of the most understudied tensions in Civil War history. Grant was celebrated. He was promoted. He became the face of Union victory, then the face of the nation as president. Thomas was overlooked in a way that bordered on deliberate. Part of it was Thomas's own personality. He was not political. He did not lobby for recognition. He did not collect journalists the way Grant collected cigars. He was not interested in the narrative of war. He was interested in winning it. But part of it was something uglier. Thomas was a Virginian. He was born in Southampton County, Virginia, the same region where Nat Turner had launched his slave rebellion 30 years earlier. He came from a slave-holding family. When Virginia seceded, his family burned his photograph and his letters. They considered him a traitor. His sisters never spoke to him again for the rest of his lives. They turned his portrait to the wall. George Thomas chose the Union over his home, his family, and his blood, and the Union never fully forgave him for having once been Virginian. There was always a shadow of suspicion. He was always slightly outside the inner circle. Grant never fully trusted him. Sherman, who was Grant's closest friend, openly dismissed him as slow and overly cautious. He called him Old Slow Trot behind his back. The nickname was half affectionate and half contemptuous, and yet the record is clean. Thomas never lost a battle he commanded, not one. He lost ground at Chickamauga, yes, but his sector never broke. He never ran. He never surrendered a position he had been ordered to hold. He won at Mill Springs early in the war. He won at Chattanooga. A year later, in December of 1864, at the Battle of Nashville, he would execute one of the most perfectly planned and catastrophically destructive offensive campaigns in American military history, destroying John Bell Hood's Army of Tennessee so completely that it ceased to exist as a fighting force. He would do it after Grant had tried 3 times to relieve him for moving too slowly. 3 times Grant sent orders telling Thomas to attack immediately. 3 times Thomas told him to wait. Grant actually dispatched General John Logan to Nashville with orders to relieve Thomas on the spot if the attack had not begun by the time Logan arrived. Thomas attacked the morning before Logan got there. He destroyed Hood's army in 2 days. When the news reached Grant, Logan turned around and went home without delivering his papers. What would have been an embarrassing act of insubordination was instead retroactively transformed into another example of Thomas being difficult, slow, and requiring constant pressure from above before he would act. That is the story they told about Thomas. That he needed to be pushed. That he was dragged into action by the urgency of his superiors. But consider the counter-evidence. At Chickamauga, he had not been slow. He had been a rock. At Missionary Ridge, his men had not been timid. They had climbed a fortified mountain without orders. At Nashville, his 2-day assault had not been desperate improvisation. It had been a surgical dismemberment. Thomas moved slowly, in the same way a surgeon moves slowly. Not because he lacked nerve, because he understood that every action has consequences, and that consequences, once set in motion, cannot be recalled. Grant's most dangerous order at Chattanooga was not simply the order to take the rifle pits. It was the embedded assumption within that order that the Army of the Cumberland was a supporting character in someone else's story. The dangerous part was the plan that required Thomas's men to stand still in a killing ground, serving as bait, while Sherman did the real fighting miles away. If Thomas had followed that order to the letter, if his men had huddled in those open rifle pits, waiting for a signal that never came because Sherman was already bogging down on the Confederate right, the result would have been predictable. Artillery from above, flanking fire from the remaining Confederate positions, hundreds of men dead, and nothing to show for it except a tactical position at the base of a mountain that did not change a single thing about the strategic situation. Thomas did not countermand Grant's order. He did not openly refuse it. He was too precise a soldier for that kind of theater. What he did was something subtler and, in the end, more consequential. He positioned his men. He briefed his officers. He gave the signal, and then he watched. He watched his army make a decision that no set of orders could fully contain, and when Grant turned and asked him who had ordered those men up the ridge, Thomas answered with the flat, unblinking honesty of a man who has spent his whole life refusing to pretend. Nobody ordered them. They went themselves. And the truth underneath that answer, the truth Thomas carried in his chest without ever speaking it aloud, was this. A man who truly knows his army, knows when to give orders and when to get out of their way. Grant was the best commander the Union produced when it came to strategy, when it came to the big board, the map, the long view of attrition and logistics. But at Chattanooga on November 25, 1863, the better commander of the Army of the Cumberland was the army itself. the victory at Missionary Ridge broke the Confederate grip on Tennessee permanently. It opened the door to Georgia. It opened the door to Sherman's march. It cracked the strategic shell of the Confederacy in the Deep South in a way that Gettysburg, for all its drama, had not. After Missionary Ridge, the Confederacy could still fight, but it could not win. The math was done. The Ridge was the turning point that doesn't get nearly the credit it deserves, because the story of how it happened is too messy, too unauthorized, too impossible to fit into a clean narrative about commanders making brilliant decisions. Grant went on to receive his promotion to General of the Armies. He went on to pin Lee against Petersburg and end the war. He went on to the presidency and to history books that carved him in granite. Thomas went on to Nashville and his greatest victory, and a level of obscurity that still feels like a debt the history owes him. He never complained about it. He never lobbied for recognition. When reporters asked him after Nashville how it felt to have proven Grant wrong, he looked at them with the expression of a man who does not understand why the question is being asked. It was not about proving anyone wrong. It was about finishing the job. He died in 1870 at his desk, still in uniform, writing an official response to an article that had slighted his record. He was 63. He never went back to Virginia. His sisters never reached out. He was buried in New York. At Missionary Ridge, they will tell you that the charge was spontaneous. They will tell you it was one of those accidents of war, those moments where fortune steps in and the math goes out the window and men do the impossible because no one told them it was impossible. And that is true. But it is not the whole truth. The whole truth is that George Thomas had spent 2 months watching those men, eating with those men, enduring the siege alongside those men, and he knew what they were capable of before Grant ever gave his order. He knew that when the moment came, they would not stop at the rifle pits. They would not perform a demonstration. They would not be a distraction. They would take the ridge. He just needed Grant to give them permission to walk toward it. The rest, Thomas knew, those men would handle on their own. Grant stood on Orchard Knob and watched the Confederate flags come down and the Union flags go up, one after another, along the crest of a ridge that was not supposed to be taken. He chewed his cigar. He said nothing for a long time. Later, he would write about the charge with the careful, qualified language of a man recalibrating his understanding of what soldiers are capable of when you stop telling them they're only good for a diversion. But in that moment, on that cold November afternoon, with the sound of the rebel retreat echoing through the valley and the guns finally going quiet on a ridge that should have been impregnable, there was one man on Orchard Knob who was not surprised, one man who had seen it coming from miles away, one man who had received the order to stop at the rifle pits and had simply, quietly, in his way, understood that some orders are written by generals and some orders are written by history. And on this particular afternoon, history had outranked them both. The Rock of Chickamauga stood and watched his army do what rocks do best. He watched them hold the line. He watched them refuse to stop. He watched them win. And when it was over, he folded his field glasses, turned from the ridge, and said nothing at all.